Hello everyone! In this clip we are going to show you how you can center a div or an element. Actually, this question, how to center an element, is one of the most frequently asked questions, and on Stack Overflow has a lot of views. So we can actually start with the simplest way that I believe is the simplest one, and is using flex display. For start, I have created a div here. It has a class of container, then there's a p tag inside it with some text, and we have applied some CSS properties in order to be able to see the div that we have here. And for start, let's even zoom a little more so that you can see clearly. So for this, the simplest way we actually discussed in our short video, we can use a display of flex and a justify contents of center and an align items of center. What these CSS properties do? Well, when we set the display of something to flex, well, now that we have set the display of this container to flex, we can control the items that are inside this flex display. Unlike the display inline or display block, which they change the behavior of the element itself, but this display flex wouldn't make some changes to the element inside, but you can control the items inside the container. So this effect will be applied to the items inside something which has a flex display flex. So for this justify contents and align items, there are so many different values that you can check out yourself. You can hit inspect on them, and you can go, for example, here inside this justify contents, we have applied center to this, but you can go ahead and check out all of the different values for that. For example, scratch, normal. You can see that there are lots of different things. For these things, for space around, space between, and space evenly, in order to understand them, you need to have more than one element inside your container. So for that, we are not going to talk about this justifying content and align items too much, because we just want to focus on putting this element at the center. But if you are interested, you can use the inspect element tool in order to find out what these justify content and align items they do actually. So, and this was the first way, which actually I believe is the simplest way. Let's try out the second way. And for the second way, we are going to use display grid. See, let's clean this display. Let's not clean them. Let's just comment them out for a moment, and hit refresh. And of course, you can see that the element is no longer at center. And there's another way called display grid, and this display grid is a way that has so many options, so many features that you can go ahead and check out in the documentation for yourself. But if we are going to put the item at the center, both vertically and horizontally, there's actually just one single command, and that's called place items, and we can put the place items on center. And you can see now we can hit refresh, and sure enough, the item is now at the center. Well, these two ways that we use, you can actually use that in pretty much everywhere and all times, but there are some circumstances, some scenarios that these display flex and display grid, they cannot help us. And that's where we are working with CSS Positions. So for that case, you need to learn the old way of putting the items at the center. We're working with positions. When positions in CSS come in, well, working with them is a little tricky. And let's see an example in order to understand what do I mean. Let's imagine that we have let's create another div here. We call this class we assigned a class of box to this class. And let's imagine that this box, okay, has a, for example, let's assign a width and height to this one. For example, 250 pixel width it has a height of 250 pixel width. So this is actually a square. And let's apply a background color to this one so that we can see that. Let's use, for example, this green one for the background color. I want to use positions here. Let's imagine that I have for example, a span tag, and there's something, for example, we have a 10% off here, a text, and we want to put this 10% off at the top right of this item. So let's apply some margins to this box so it has some space with around it. So here it is, and let's imagine that this 10% off, this span that we have, let's apply this class off to this one, dot off, and let's imagine that this has, let's apply another background color to this so that we can see it. For example, the background color that we are going to give it, let's use dark green for this one, and let's give it a border because I want to see, to make that more visible for you. Solid, and let's use this dark green actually. Sorry, this dark green, no, the green itself here. Okay, so come back here, hit refresh, and let's set the color to white and give it some padding to this. Padding 10 pixel, and of course when I say padding 10 pixel something here, let's imagine that I want to move this item at the top right of the element, so we use positions for this one. If you already know about position, it's great, but if you don't know, I will talk about positions for you. If we assign a position of relative to the parent element and assign a position of absolute to this one, now we can position this item, this span, compared to this box. Okay, what do I mean by that? For example, if I say top, for example, 0 pixels, it means go ahead and have 0 space from top, and if I say right 0, it means go ahead and have 0 space from right, and what happens is it goes at the top right. And of course, if you use a negative value, for example 15 pixels, negative 15 pixels, it goes upper compared to that. Okay, so for this one, this becomes a little tricky now, so that's why I said it's a good idea to learn the old way of putting items at the center. For this one, let's imagine that someone comes and says, hey, you see this 10% off here, I want you to move it to the center and put it there, exactly. So for this one, this display flex and display grid, well, we can use them, but for this example, it's not handy as well. So there's something in CSS for when we are using this combination of position relative and position absolute, and actually it's a common thing. This combination of relative and absolute is something that is pretty much used, is frequently used by different developers. When we apply a position relative to the parent and an absolute position to the child, and this is pretty much common. In these circumstances, in order to move something at the center, we can use something called, we have to use two properties. First of all, we can say left, so rather than, we have used right, okay, let's continue using the right. Rather than say that the right should be negative 15 pixel, we can say that right 15%. So let's use percent rather than pixels. When we use that, what happens is this item will be relocated 50% to the right, and you can see that the border right, the right border of this element is exactly at the middle. But that's not exactly what we wanted to do. We wanted the element itself to come at center, not the border. So that's why there's where we use another CSS property, and that's called transform translate. With transform translate, we can move objects. Let's check that out pretty quick. Translate CSS to check out very quickly in order to understand what does this transform translate does in CSS. As you can see, for the translate, it has used the translate alone, but there's also we can use that with transform as well. For transform, you have so many different functions. For example, scale makes something bigger. If we say scale, for example, 2, it makes the object 2 times bigger. So many functions. One of these functions is actually translate, and translate is actually for moving objects around. For example, if we say 50 pixels, it moves the this element 50 pixels to the right and from x direction and y direction. And if we use translate x rather than translate only alone, it moves the option the element from the left and right only. So if we use right 50% for that, so we can use 50% for this one as well. And if we come back here, hit refresh, we can see this is now fixed. So this technique that using these two properties for CSS positions is actually something that we can use for putting items at the center. And also, if we want to use this position thing for vertical alignment, for this one we have set top 15%. For this one as well, we can also use that to top 50%. If we say that top 50%. And another thing, so now we can use transform translate y, or we can just use translate alone now. 50%. But I think for the other one it's to be -50 because we used top. We can change that to bottom to fix that, or we can change that 15% to -15%. They both are completely correct and everything is great now. So the last way, using positions in order to put something at the center, both horizontally and vertically, is actually the most complicated one, but at the same time the strongest one, because you cannot use this display grid, although they are very simple and easy. You cannot use them in everywhere always, but this one is just the strongest way. So the third way was actually very good for you to learn in order to to understand the third way. So we saw one way, flex display, the second one was grid display, and the third one was actually using CSS positions, and this is the way that we use CSS positions. And this is to translate alone without using transform translate. You can use that actually alone as well if you want to, but I am used to use this transform translate. So this is it. Hope you learned something, and don't forget the third way is actually a good thing to have in mind, that this is actually a possibility. So that's it. Hope to see you in the next clips.